Could I get a thumbs up from somebody if they can see our title page? Perfect. Okay, thank you all for that. The first presentation to kick us off today. We have the lucky position of being sandwiched in the middle of all this awesome research, and we're going to talk a little bit about food, speaking of sandwiches.
So to begin, all of our interest in food started, as you can see, when we were very young. Mine mostly involves smearing blueberries on my face and on the walls. But through my medical and surgical training, I've become increasingly aware of the neglected impact of food on health and the dual role that it could play in mitigating climate change, which is what got me really interested in this part of the research.
My primary interest in this project was to apply psychology towards sustainability goals. I like to think about why we make the choices we do, and especially when those choices don't align with our attitudes and values.
Like everyone else, I was really interested in the potential power of behavioral influence to affect good, but I was also slightly concerned about some of the ethical tensions involved in that. So that was a driving interest.
Yeah, and I grew up spending a lot of time outdoors and have moved on to trying to communicate about climate change in a good way that motivates people into action. And this felt like a great chance to practice some of that. Before we get started too, we want to acknowledge that we're each joining from somewhere that's become special to us, but was special and important to groups of people, Indigenous people, long before they were important to us and still are.
Yeah, thank you, Nigel, for that. So we'll begin our talk by situating our research and defining concepts like food systems as sustainability within our context. And then we'll review how behavioral strategies have been used to encourage particular food choices, what are some of the ethical concerns that this has raised, and how we've chosen to address them in our research. We'll then take you through the design and results of our survey, which involved over 300 of our families, friends, and colleagues, examining how factors influence their food choices. And finally, we'll tell you about the recommendations that are coming out of our study. So food has been highlighted as the single strongest lever to optimize human health and environmental sustainability on Earth by a variety of groups, including the Eat Lancet Commission. Next slide. So it's making food a particularly interesting but complex area to tackle. So as we move forward in our presentation, I want to make an important distinction that when we talk about food systems, we'll be talking about the globalized, industrialized, and specialized food systems, which is the one that many of us exist within, or at least interact with commonly in North America. And it's not to say that there are no other food systems in existence, but rather that this is one that most of us are familiar with and one that is quite problematic. In this context, food systems involves everything from the growing of food, its transport and production, its consumption, and eventual disposal. And food systems are by definition complex adaptive systems. If we think of food in the context of Holling's panarchy, we can come to appreciate, as many other authors have, that in our efforts to increase efficiency through globalization, specialization, and industrializations, we've optimized processes, but increased simplicity and reduced redundancy. And in doing so, we've contributed to decreasing the overall resilience of our food system. There's several authors and groups that have tried to define sustainability within food systems. And though there's not one perfect definition, there's some general principles that have emerged. A lot of them center around delivering food security and nutrition, not only to our generation, but to future generations, touching on this topic of intergenerationality. And there's a recognition that this has to exist within healthy economic, social, and environmental system to be allowed to perdure. Next slide. So when we think of sustainability within the context of food systems, what often comes to mind first for many are the environmental impacts of food systems, which are numerous. Include things like greenhouse gas emissions, significant land use, pressures on our water bodies, as well as biodiversity. And these may be more readily quantifiable to a certain degree, but they're not the only issues with food systems. Food systems, when we think of sustainability, have impacts on individual health, on food security and safety, which includes worker safety. They raise issues in terms of justice, the right to food, ethics for human and non-human agents. There is questions about equity, not only between genders, but also within and between societies. They bring up issues around food sovereignty and land ownership and displacement, and play a significant role in global stability and conflicts. So when we've tried to boil all that down to one single metric, It was evidently not easy, but we eventually decided to talk about greenhouse gas emissions for a few different reasons. In part because greenhouse gas emissions are slightly more recognizable in general language, though perhaps not as well understood as the granular level, as Brynley will talk about. In general, carbon-intensive products, especially the most intensive, tend to have higher environmental and societal consequences. And greenhouse gas emissions are featured widely as targets in international agreements and national plans for climate action. And as such, there are some recommendations for reduced consumptions that pertain to specific categories, mostly centered around livestock and dairy production, with a recognition that this excludes hunting meat and highly processed foods, because these result in significant environment, individual, and societal impacts. However, we do want to recognize that we're working on one piece of the puzzle, and we're focusing on individual consumption and the demands that this places on our food systems, which affects climate, our ecosystems, and socioeconomic systems. But we must recognize that we're still operating within the constraints of externalities and pressures that are put on individuals by the system. Finally, there are still benefits to addressing individual choices. Not only can eating better or more sustainably improve individual health, but overall happiness, it's one way that, or one of the most impactful ways that we can individually tackle climate change. And it's a way to also invite us to re-examine our relations with food. And with that, I'll pass it over to Brynley.
So in terms of targeting individuals, there are many different behavioral interventions that have been studied. So to build off our discussion about nudges in this class, I'm going to provide a few examples of strategies that have been effective in food choice experiments, and then introduce some of the ethical questions our group has been thinking a lot about. Both of these informed our survey design and will guide the next phase of our project. So for those who completed our survey, some of these strategies will be familiar, and I'm not going to dwell on the numbers or statistics, but all of these strategies significantly shifted behavior towards food choices associated with lower emissions. So first, adding a line to shopping carts, shown in yellow here, to indicate how much space produce should fill, influences how much produce is purchased. The larger the allocated space, the more produce in the cart. This is an example of a visual cue to guide decisions. Reminders have also been effective. Daily text messages about the environmental benefits of reduced meat diets led participants to consume less red meat 1 month after the intervention. And framing presents a very easy change, displaying vegetarian dishes on menus as the chef's recommendation, or simply listing them first increases vegetarian selections. As for norms, participants were more likely to choose a meatless lunch when they were told 30% of Americans have started to make an effort to limit their meat consumption, resulting in double the number of meatless orders at a cafe. And lastly, a personal favorite example, defaults are incredibly powerful. In this example, people were given a default menu with 5 vegetarian options and told that another menu on the wall 4 meters away listed 5 other meat alternatives. 92% of the orders were vegetarian with this default setup, compared to only 44% of orders when all 10 dishes were listed on the main menu. Most of these examples change the choice environment without providing education or enhancing individuals' own decision-making capabilities. And this brings us to our preferred strategy of informative labeling. It is first important to note that conceptualizing the greenhouse gas emissions associated with different food products is difficult. In this graph, the x-axis shows actual greenhouse gas emissions of different products, and the y-axis shows people's estimates for the emissions. Blue points are appliances, and red points are food items. Accurate guesses would fall on the diagonal line. As you can see, all the food items are underestimated, and the most carbon intensive, like beef and lamb, are furthest below the line, meaning they are underestimated to the greatest extent. This poor understanding presents a barrier to greener action that can be addressed with well-designed labels that enable informed decision-making. Carbon labels have been empirically tested in many different contexts, including online experiments and real-world tests in university cafeterias, restaurants, and grocery stores. In general, these labels have reduced purchases of meat or beef, led to increased sales of climate-friendly dishes, and shifted selection to products with lower emissions within the same category of food, for example, types of milk. There's a wide range of labels being designed and tested, and this is both within academia and by companies. Here are 3 examples that use very basic messaging, whether that's low, medium, high, or simply labeling low carbon foods as climate friendly. At the other end of the spectrum are highly detailed labels. The one on the left offers more resolution at the lower impact end of the scale to help people shift between yellow and green foods, as most items are within this range. And in the middle is a more complicated label in which multiple environmental components, including carbon, are scored. Every label I've shown has been found to shift behavior, on average, towards lower carbon foods. So the evidence is growing that these interventions generally, and labels specifically, are effective. And the next question is whether they are good. We believe that nudging has value, and also that the risks presented on this slide are very real and need to be acknowledged, reduced, and compensated for. So these are the 6 main critiques we've come across in the literature. Nudges focus on individuals and ignore structural problems. Decisions are shaped by the technocratic elite. Nudges are patronizing in the way they view citizens as irrational and incompetent. Nudges maintain existing consumption practices and promote the status quo. Freedom of choice is not truly preserved due to time and effort costs and because behavior has been altered. And lastly, nudges are covert and manipulative by unconsciously shifting behavior. And now Jack will walk us through some of the ways that we can consider these ethical problems.
Yeah, that was great, Brynley. So yeah, as Brynley mentioned, there's all this ethical baggage with nudges and kind of a general icky vibe, at least at first glance. So this section, we're going to be talking about how we, as a group, have been trying to negotiate that. Yeah, next slide. So just as a bit of backdrop, this electrifying diagram shows we've got the literature reviews survey in the middle, and then we've got a nudging work with Fresh Prep, which is a real life nudging project we're hoping to do after this. So that's something to keep in mind while we're talking about our ethical considerations. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a schema we came up with. If you'll allow me to stretch the maze metaphor a little bit, this is sort of a map out of the maze. And on the right, we have our good nudges. So these are the things that we really want to focus on. So that involves collaborative development, transparent presentation, and informed consent when it comes to implementation. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we've got our bad nudges, which is unilateral, deceptive, and domineering. So obviously we want to be avoiding all of those things. So that's all fairly straightforward and definitely intuitively sound. But then we have these consequences, which is a lot messier, and I'll get into yapping about that later. But first, the bad nudges. So yeah, here's a couple of case studies. If you'll get them all up, Nigel, so we can churn through them as one. So we've got Denmark's first. This is a fat tax they did. It was a regressive tax. It was eventually dropped after just over a year because it was seen to be unfairly punishing socioeconomically vulnerable people, which it was, so really grim. CDC trial in Australia. This was a cashless debit card trial, which they did in Western Australia. Part of their kind of paternalizing approach to Indigenous relations, really grim as well, undermining Indigenous sovereignty. And then Harvard Dining Service, this one was about putting calories, like a numerical value, calorie-wise, on every piece of food and on the Harvard campus, really insensitive to mental health and eating disorders, a big fallout, and they eventually dropped it and replaced it with nutritional information. So these are all like very disparate, myriad ethical failings, but the things they have in common, referring back to that map, is unilateral. They weren't done in that collaborative sense that we want. They were opaque. No effort was made to inform the target group at any point, and domineering. Explicit consent was never asked for. So really grim, doomed to fail in practice and ethically. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is where it gets a bit freakier. So agential impact, this is a question relating to what degree nudges aid freedom or reduce freedom and restrict one. So our take on this is a compatibilist theory of freedom, at the moment pioneered by this guy, Harry Frankfurt. You'll see an image of the little cues on the right. But Hume was the first guy to kind of discuss this in the common discourse. The basic gist is Agent X is free so long as they're able to do what they want to do. So you'll note that it's a very internal definition of freedom. The graph below should hopefully shed some light on that. We've got first order volitions, otherwise known as a desire. Second order volitions, fancy word for a feeling about that desire. Willing smoker has the cravings to smoke, but thinks it's really cool. Absolutely loves it. He's smoking, he's free. Quitting smoker has the same cravings, but doesn't want to have those cravings. He's unfree precisely because these different volitions are misaligned. Next slide, please. Yeah, so relating this back to meat, we can create a similar kind of thing. We've got the willing beef eater. We're not targeting this person. They're happy, they love their meat, you do you. Quitting beef eater is someone, we want to align their values. We want them to be free. They also want to be free, hence the misalignment. And we're trying to help them out. That's kind of the premise of our nudging. Next slide, please. So this is also pretty messy. This is a pretty iconic Twitter exchange. BP trying to accuse the general public of doing unsavory stuff. And as we'll remember, they're not exactly stellar ethical paragons. So they suck. Next thing. And this is indicative of like a much broader issue, which happens again and again in capitalism. We see it, most recent example of Coca-Cola, where they just shift all of the blame of their environmental destruction onto consumers, absolves them of consequences and protects the broader systems. This is obviously awful. So the degree to which nudges have been used to kind of put a smiling face on this machine is really grim. We're super aware of that. But our kind of response in the face of this kind of unease is that nudges and systemic change are compatible. It's been done before. At the logical level, they do work beautifully together. Consumers are collectively powerful. We know this. We've seen boycotts have a huge impact. Even though individually they might be guiltless, together they can really do something important. And then, like naked mole rats scurrying through the soil, nudges are our tunnels and odor trails. So this insanely unsavory imagery is just used to highlight the fact that there is nudges everywhere all the time. There's architects, there's urban planners, there's software engineers. They're nudging us nonstop. So given that that's the situation, we may as well add some ethical nudges to the mix. Next slide. Don't need to worry about this. This was just the kind of emerging out of the maze metaphor. This is the ethically sound nudging that we want to aim for. Really crucial underpinning is this democratic bit. That's where our surveying came in, and that's what Brynley's about.
Yeah, so to connect these ethical questions to our survey, I'm going to refer to two quotes that motivated our thinking. The first comes from the original book about nudging, and I want to emphasize the part about influencing choices in a way that will make choosers better off as judged by themselves. I think this component often gets forgotten in our discussions, and while we cannot always know what people want, asking them is a good first step. And this ties into the second quote from the nudge, nudge, think, think piece that we all read this term. John et al. Argue that think strategies, or deliberative democracy, can be used to identify and legitimize nudge strategies that work. And that led into the survey we designed to find out whether people think these various nudges are useful and desirable. So we designed our survey to better understand people's considerations and barriers when buying food, baseline knowledge about carbon footprints of foods, and most importantly, levels of support for different strategies to shift behavior. We hope to discover whether people want these strategies in place to help them make more climate-friendly choices. The survey contained open-ended, Likert type, and discrete choice questions. It was available for 2 weeks on Qualtrics, and we recruited participants on UBC student platforms, as well as friends and family. We also hoped that people without a background in sustainability would find the survey educational and learn a little about the climate impacts of dietary choices. So here are some summary demographics from our survey respondents. We had a total of 329 participants, 66% were female, and the majority were white, with the most common age category being 25 to 34 years. Approximately 40% of the respondents had an education background or current education in sustainability, and most people had omnivorous diets, with about 20% identifying as vegetarian or vegan. So first, I'll go through our analysis of the open responses about barriers people face that make it challenging to buy foods that align with their values. We thematically coded responses and found that the most common theme was financial barriers, which was expected. People listed many important attributes that have a higher price tag, including plant-based, locally grown, fair trade, organic, fresh, less processed, healthy, ethical, and sustainable foods. And they just can't always afford to choose these sustainable and morally superior options. The second most common barrier was availability and access. This included references to limited options in small towns, far distances from suitable vendors with good selection, missing products and infrastructure, as well as the need to visit multiple stores. The theme we were most interested in was information, both regarding biophysical impacts and social dimensions. Participants were concerned about greenwashed, non-transparent marketing, as well as a lack of time to properly research best choices. They noted both a lack of clear labeling and information overload when making decisions. And here is one particularly illustrative quote. I would really like to be able to measure the environmental impact of buying food. Using where the food was grown is a poor proxy, but it works. The ideal measure would be a label similar to the nutritional information, but for the greenhouse gas emissions equivalent. Not having that measure is definitely a barrier. This respondent would definitely be excited about our project's longer-term goals. Lastly, respondents' answers revealed complex trade-offs in different values and barriers. So here's one quotation to illustrate this complexity and also to serve as an example of our thematic analysis coding method that 2 of us completed for all of the responses. Balancing COVID-19, don't want to go out. Takeout, struggle to support DoorDash given precarious labor profiting while small businesses struggle. And lack of ease, extra effort it takes to be conscious all the time, price, distance to travel to different specialty stores. We recognize that addressing this range of barriers is essential for true shifts in our food systems, and that behavioral interventions alone are not a single solution to overcoming these barriers.
All right, thanks Brynley and Jack and Annie. That base information is extremely important to contextualize what we want to talk about next, which were the categorical responses to our survey. So this is where our participants had the options of choosing certain boxes to indicate the things that they considered when they were buying food, the types of behavioral strategies that they thought would work, and the ones that they thought that they would like to see in the stores where they shop. So first off, when we asked respondents to indicate how strongly they agreed that they considered various food purchasing factors, they somewhat agree or strongly agree was the most common response for all considerations, except for whether I've seen it advertised or promoted recently. So that was good for us to hear. So I'll walk you through this chart a little bit because there's a lot of information going on here. But each of the statements here along the side that are truncated a little, but we're happy to provide the full text if anybody's interested. But each of these represents a food consideration that we listed. You can see that it was rated on this scale where we had strongly disagree to strongly agree with a neutral point in the middle. The ones that came up at the top, perhaps not surprisingly, were how much people enjoyed the taste, the overall healthiness, calories or macronutrients, and the price or whether they were on sale, taking the lead. And you can see in the distribution over here that most of the responses fall in the somewhat agree or strongly agree category at that end of the scale. At the bottom end of the considerations, we have whether I've seen it advertised or promoted recently. We have also whether they are made with non-GMO ingredients falling pretty low. But both of these, you can see, have a little bit more interesting distribution with responses sort of falling across the scale or even possibly bimodal for the non-GMO ingredients, showing that maybe there's two separate sort of groups of participants responding to how they respond to their food values on that question and others. Okay, so what do participants think would change the way that they make their food choices? So we asked respondents to indicate how strongly they agreed that any of these specific nudges would help them to make more environmentally friendly food decisions. The ones we're going to look at first here, we're calling information strategies. So these are similar to what Brynley and Jack were talking about earlier as nudges that are specifically designed to leave the choice in the hands of the person making the decision just by providing them more information that they can do with what they will. So we can see, again, really high support for all nudges except two sort of obvious outliers, one in this section of information nudges, and that would be the text messages or smartphone alerts. And I think we can all probably imagine why that one wasn't as popular, but interesting that people thought that it wouldn't affect their choices as well. And the other set of these strategies that we showed, we call them the other strategies, but they're really just a range of things, including financial nudges or default options. The unpopular one in this group, again, you can see in the distribution here that overwhelmingly people somewhat agree or strongly agree that these would affect their behavior, but a default setting to pay a small fee that they're able to opt out of had this really wide distribution where there were some people saying that they strongly disagreed that would affect their behavior and some people saying it would they strongly agree that would affect their behavior. The most interesting part of this to me is that it's a few points up, almost a full point on our Likert scale from the default setting to pay a small fee where you're allowed to opt out to the mandatory small fee where you're not able to opt out. So people are accurately thinking forward to their future selves and saying, oh, if I'm able to opt out, it's not going to affect my behavior because I will just opt out then. So those were the sets of nudges that we asked. And in this first scenario, when we were asking them, it was, do you think they're going to affect, do you think they would affect your behavior? When we again asked them, okay, so surprise, there is research that shows that at least in some samples, all of those do have the possibility of helping people align their behavior according to their values that they provide. Once you know that information, which of these would you like to see in the stores where you shop or in the restaurants where you shop? And this also, similar to the last slide, we saw reflected here, their support for the different strategies with the optional fee supported significantly less than the mandatory fee again. But together with texts, those three kind of rounding out the least supported nudges of the ones that we offered. So people don't want bothered on their phones and they're not really keen on fees being used regardless of if they're optional or not. The most supported we were happy to see was a small discount on low impact foods. So obviously that discount has to come from somewhere, and in that sense it's similar to the fees, but at least in how it's framed, it feels like you're coming away with a discount for something. And the environmental impact here is the comprehensive environmental impact. So people think that they would like to see sort of a list of all the different environmental impacts, as well as more options, vegetarian options on menus is the third place here. And that was one of our only significant differences when we ran the analysis by gender. So women, participants who identified as women more significantly saying that they wanted that one. And greenhouse gas emission info also rating pretty highly. But as you can see over here on the right, pretty good overall support for having these implemented. And of the 270 respondents who selected at least one response, nobody selected none. So we call that a win. So this is a distribution of how many of each of those strategies each individual chose. So at the very far left here, some participants, I think only 3, said that they were interested in having one of these nudges at least. And there was also some at the other far end, but mostly people were choosing a number of nudges in the bulk of this data, which we're pretty excited about. The average was 8. Most respondents at least somewhat agreed that the survey made them want to rethink the impact of their food choices. That would be this first question here, and we can see that the mode of the distribution is somewhat agree, pretty solidly, and as well that it made them more aware of the impacts of the contributions of their food to climate change, the second one here, and similarly there with maybe a little bit more in the strongly agree. What was really interesting though is that this relationship appears to be moderated by having studied or studying in a field related to the environment. So if we look at this next little graph, this is for the first one, made me want to rethink my food choices. The Y current group are people who said, yes, I'm currently studying in a field related to the environment. There are 43 of them, and 18 of those were people who had taken or are taking currently RES 510. And the yes previous group were people who say that they have previously have studied in a field related to the environment, also including a part of that 18. And no are people who say, no, I've never studied anything related to the environment. So we see that, at least for this first question, the survey made me want to rethink my food choices. People who studied in the environment were much more undecided about how the survey made them feel. Those who don't have as much exposure to these concepts thought, yeah, this makes sense. This is really going to change my thinking. So that gave us something to think about. And this is the very, very similar distribution for the second question. The survey made me more aware of the climate impacts of food. So those currently studying sustainability, including some in our class, also had this little bit more of a range, perhaps thinking, well, I already knew a lot of this stuff, so the survey didn't do a ton for me in that respect. But people who studied a while ago in this case, and people who had never studied found it very useful. So we didn't find a difference between strategies that people supported based on their environmental education, besides the couple I mentioned, or gender, besides the vegetarian options at restaurants, or age. Taken 510 was only significant for the helpfulness of the survey, but not any of the strategies. And we were happy to see that there were this strong belief in the effectiveness of the information strategies, except for the text and except for the small fee. This very poorly rated slide is just a little bit more information on how respondents answered our questions that were designed to get to the bottom of greenhouse gas literacy. So asking participants to decide between a hamburger, for example, and a veggie burger, which one would have more carbon. We were blown away by the response to this question, with almost all participants scoring 0, 1, or 2 questions wrong out of our 6 questions that we asked. Okay, so what's the gist of these survey results? Well, the response was positive and constructive. Respondents thought our strategies would be effective and wanted to see them implemented. And the difference between those who've studied in a field related to the environment and those who hadn't was interesting to us. So we'd like to wrap up our presentation with some experimental recommendations from our research for organizations who are selling food products.
Yeah, so the first recommendation is involve consumers. This is something which our sample, we just click them all out, Nigel, and I'll yap about them as one. So yeah, the first one is that consumers, as we've hopefully demonstrated, often want these nudges, but they do have some preferences about the kinds of ones that they want. So asking them what they want is a really vital part of the process. Individual opt-in is obviously the maximum consent method. That's obviously the preferred one. But where this isn't possible because of time pressure or because it's not possible in like a physical supermarket, for example, surveying is definitely the second best and should be done too. And then finally, this point that we've really tried to hammer home, choice architecture is always there. So we can't just not do this. So doing it in a way that involves people definitely seems the most sensible. And finally, there should be one last point on this one. Yeah, so in cases where consumer preferences are unknown, any kind of time pressured situation outside of the food context, we could maybe use COVID as an example, where we don't have time to sort of get people's thoughts on these nudges. Transparency and context sensitivity are indispensable to maintaining your nudges' morality.
So our second recommendation centered on the potential harms of nudging. So it's important to integrate the considerations of people for whom recommending or encouraging specific foods might be harmful or oppressive. For instance, people with eating disorders are victims of systemic oppression. When nudging individuals, one should provide adequate warnings and ensure that there's avenues to preferably opt in or alternatively opt out of the nudge where possible. However, if the nudge is unavoidable, information should be available both to the intended and unintended audience, highlighting, for instance, the importance of unrestricted eating or unstigmatized access to traditionally sustainable foods.
Oops, 1 year on Zoom, you'd think I'd remember to unmute. Our third recommendation is to try to provide educational content where possible. Previous research and the results from our survey show that people like nudges that they can learn from when they don't feel like they're happening behind their back. So when using strategies that don't contain informational components like labels, you might consider adding an educational component that can give people more power over their decisions. We also have some general recommendations for researchers. We think that researchers should be looking into who are nudges effective for and why. They should be bringing work on structural responses into the conversation. They should be doing exploratory research into current negative nudges that's currently happening behind closed doors in the white and gray literature of corporations. And we're curious about how nudges work together, either additively or multiplicatively, and also importantly, crucially, the history, socioeconomics, culture, and power structures that affect how nudges work and for whom. In conclusion, we live in a world of nudges. As Jack so viscerally illustrated earlier with these naked mole rats, and we're pretty much at the mercy of these when they're done without our knowledge. Many pressures push us to act against our values, but intentional, ethical nudges can help us align our choices to those values when we decide we want that, and nudges and systemic changes can then work better together. Thanks very much.